A hand closes over his shoulder in the dark, and he is on his feet before he understands why. No candle blown out, no voice raised, just fingers, cold through wool, pressing once, hard, and gone. Somewhere above him, a single oil lamp still burns against the far wall, the only point of light in a room built for 40 men. And by that thin orange glow, he can already see the others moving, shapes rising off straw mattresses without a word between them, boots already half on their feet, belts already at their waists because the belts never really came off. His name does not matter yet. Call him Brother Amar, a knight of the Order of the Temple, somewhere inside a fortress on the coast of the Holy Land, in a winter colder than anything he was told to expect before he left his home in the West. What matters is this: nobody in that room asked what the hand meant. Nobody asked if it was an attack, a drill, or the call to prayer in the middle of the night. The body simply obeyed, because obedience is the only thing that had been trained into it more deeply than fear. This is not a story about swords crossing in daylight, about banners and speeches and the roar of a charge. This is about the hours nobody talks about, the hours between the last prayer of the evening and the first light of morning, when hundreds of men who had crossed a sea to die for their faith lay down on stone floors in the middle of a hostile land and tried, in the strict and narrow way their order allowed, to sleep. You think you know what a knight's life looked like: armor, horses, glory. What almost nobody pictures is this: a man lying fully dressed on a thin mat, a lamp burning above his head that he is forbidden to extinguish, a belt he is forbidden to remove, and a silence so complete that the smallest whisper could bring a punishment recorded and read aloud in front of every brother in the house. Records from the rule that govern these men describe it in blunt, almost bureaucratic language, the kind of language men write when they have already learned, through loss, exactly what happens when discipline slips for even one night. Sleep in shirt and breeches and stockings, it says. Keep a light burning until morning. Do not speak once the last office of the evening has ended. These are not poetic instructions. They are the product of men who had buried brothers because a garrison was slow to wake and had decided that slowness would never happen again if they could help it. Before we go further, understand the shape of what is coming. This one rule, sleep clothed, sleep lit, sleep silent, touches almost everything else in a Templar's daily existence in this land, from the fortress walls of Atlit on the sea to the high stone towers of Safed above the Sea of Galilee, from the crowded garrison houses of Acre down to the exposed outposts near Gaza, where the desert wind found every crack in the stone by midnight. Understand the rule, and you begin to understand how 300 men could hold territory that armies 10 times their size wanted taken from them. Amar had arrived less than a year before, from a small holding near Tours, on a ship that took 6 weeks and left half its passengers sick with a fever nobody could name. He had imagined, like most young men who took vows in Europe and dreamed of the desert, a life of heat, of dust, of gold light on old stone. He had not imagined the cold. Nobody had warned him properly because the men who could have warned him had stopped thinking of it as strange. The chill came down from the hills after sunset in a way that felt almost personal, sliding under doors, through arrow slits, along corridors with no fire lit past the kitchens, because fuel in this land was rationed like everything else that had to be shipped, carried, or fought for. The first night he understood, really understood, was in a dormitory not unlike the one you are picturing now. 40 cots, 40 men, one lamp, and a chill that came up out of the stone floor itself. The same stone that had baked under the sun for 12 hours and given every drop of that heat back to the sky the moment the sun dropped behind the western wall. He lay on his mattress of straw, in his shirt, in his breeches, in his stockings. His sword belt loosened one notch, but never unbuckled, and he shivered until his jaw ached from clenching it shut, because even shivering too loudly in a room of sleeping brothers could be heard as a kind of disturbance. Somewhere in the dark, another man coughed once, quietly, into his own shoulder. Nobody spoke. That was the rule, too. Once Compline ended, once the last words of the evening office had been spoken, silence fell over the house like a second roof, and it did not lift again until morning. A man could be dying of a fever 3 cots away, and the room around him would still hold its tongue, because the vow of silence after the last office was not a suggestion. It was written down. It was read aloud at chapter meetings. It was enforced. You might ask why. Why build an entire military order around men who could not even whisper to each other in the dark when they were frightened or cold or grieving a brother lost that week in a skirmish outside the walls? The answer sits at the center of everything this order was trying to become. Not simply monks and not simply soldiers, but something built to function as one body, the same way a hand does not argue with itself before closing into a fist. Silence at night was not cruelty for its own sake. It was training the whole house to move as a single organism, so that when a real alarm came, not the ordinary call to matins, but a horn from the wall, a shout from the gate, 300 men could rise together, dress together, arm together in the dark, without a single wasted word. And alarms did come, not every night, not even every month, but often enough that every man in that dormitory had, at some point, felt his stomach drop through the floor at the sound of iron striking iron on the battlements above. Here is where the promise of this story begins to show itself, before it fully arrives. Somewhere ahead of us tonight is a night when the hand on the shoulder was not for prayer. Somewhere ahead of us is the difference between the 2 kinds of waking these men lived with: the gentle, practiced, half asleep, rising for the night office, and the other kind, the kind that turned a dormitory into a battlefield in under 2 minutes. We will get there.
Hurry!
But first you need to understand the ordinary knights, because without them the extraordinary ones make no sense at all. The night office came first, almost every night, sometime in the deep hours when even dreams grow thin. A bell, low and short, rang once through the corridors. Men who had drilled this motion 1,000 times swung their legs off their mattresses without opening their eyes fully, found their sandals by feel, and filed toward the chapel in a line that barely needed light to follow, because their feet already knew the number of steps. In a fortress like Atlit, this meant crossing an open yard where sea wind came straight off the water and cut through wool like it was linen. In Safed, higher and colder, frost sometimes formed on stone by the second watch of the night, and men crossing to chapel left faint prints of warmth behind them that vanished before they reached the door. Inside, the office was short, a handful of psalms, murmured more than sung, half the room still governed by sleep, even as their mouths moved through Latin they had said so many times the words had stopped being words and become something closer to breath. Then, back to the dormitory, back to the mattress, back to the cold that had been waiting, patient, for them to return to it. This happened most nights of most years. It is not the part of the story that shocks anyone at first telling. What shocks people is the layer underneath it. The reason the light burned all night, the reason the belt stayed on, The reason nobody slept the way you sleep in your own bed tonight, safe and unguarded. The light burning until dawn was not comfort. It was a decision made after other decisions had failed. A dark room is a room where a man can be killed silently before anyone else understands what has happened. A dark room is a room where a fire, started by accident or by an enemy's hand, can spread 3/4 of the way across before a single sleeper notices smoke instead of dreaming it. A dark room, in a land where raiding parties sometimes moved at night specifically because darkness slowed a garrison's response, was a vulnerability the Order had decided it could no longer afford. So the lamp burned. Oil was rationed elsewhere, spent carefully, but never here. Whatever it cost less than what had already been lost to darkness before the rule existed. None of this had appeared out of nowhere. Decades before Aymar was born, a council of churchmen gathered at Troyes in France to decide what kind of rule a new and strange sort of brotherhood should live by. Men who fought and men who prayed, folded into a single body that no existing monastic order had ever quite attempted. The bishops and abbots at that council drew heavily on the older Benedictine pattern, the same rhythm of offices and silence that had governed monasteries for centuries, and then bent it, clause by clause, to fit men who might be called from their beds not to chant but to fight. A monk in a European abbey kept silence after the last office because silence served contemplation. A Templar kept the same silence for that reason, and one more besides, because a quiet house was a house that could hear danger coming, and because men trained to hold their tongues in comfort held them just as easily in fear. The sleeping arrangements, the shirt, the stockings, the belt, the lamp, took shape gradually across the decades that followed, added to and refined by brothers who had learned in blood what the earlier drafters of the rule had only guessed at. Every clause governing the knight had, somewhere behind it, a knight that had gone wrong before the clause existed. The clothing was the same kind of decision, worn into the fabric of daily life until nobody questioned it anymore. A man sleeping in a shirt, breeches, and stockings, his belt loosened but looped, could be standing, armed, and moving toward the wall in less time than it takes to describe it. A man sleeping the way men slept back home, undressed, unhurried, trusting the night, could lose the 1/2 minute that separated a defended gate from an overrun one. Nobody in that dormitory needed this explained to them by the time they had been in the country a full year. Their bodies had simply learned it the way bodies learn to flinch from fire. Not every man in that dormitory carried the same rank, though the cold and the rule treated them almost the same. Knights slept nearest the lamp by old custom rather than written law, their mail and shields kept close enough to reach without standing. Sergeants, men of lower birth who made up the greater part of any garrison's fighting strength, often outnumbering the knights 3 or 4 to 1, slept along the far wall, their equipment simpler, their days harder in different ways, spent tending horses, standing extra watches, doing the labor that kept a fortress fed and armed, while the knights trained and prayed and stood their own share of the same cold posts. Chaplains slept apart, closer to the chapel, their nights broken by the same bells, but their days spent differently, hearing confessions, keeping what records survive, tending men too sick or too injured to rise for the offices. And beneath all of them, in outbuildings and stables, slept the Turcopoles, light cavalry recruited locally, often of mixed or Eastern Christian origin, whose knowledge of the terrain and the enemy's ways the order depended on more than most chronicles ever admitted, and whose own knights were governed by different customs entirely, watched by the same suspicious cold, answering the same horns when they sounded. By the time the lamp was lit and the silence fell, every one of these men had already spent a day that would exhaust someone half their age doing something less demanding. Knights rose before dawn for the first offices, then spent hours in the practice yard under a sun that by midday made the stone itself too hot to touch, drilling with lance and sword against wooden posts and each other, wearing mail that could weigh as much as a grown man's arm outstretched for an hour without pause. Horses had to be exercised, fed, watered, their hooves checked for the cracks that desert ground opened faster than European pasture ever had. Walls needed inspection. Stores needed counting. 100 small tasks filled every hour between the offices that structured the day the way the offices structured the night. A man did not arrive at his cot in the evening rested and merely bored. He arrived used up, muscles aching, skin raw from sun and mail both, and it was into that exhaustion that the discipline of the night was laid on top. One more layer of demand on a body that had already given most of what it had to give since before sunrise. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it changes the shape of everything that follows. A man who is only cold can eventually grow numb to cold. A man who is cold and exhausted and required, on top of both, to sleep dressed, sleep watched by lamplight, sleep in a silence that forbids even a whispered complaint, is being asked for something closer to endurance than to rest at all. Some brothers lasted decades under this pattern. Some did not last through their first year, breaking in quieter ways that the surviving records mostly pass over without detail. Men who requested transfer back to houses in Europe, men whose health simply gave out under conditions their bodies had never been built for. Men whose names appear once in a chapter roll and then not again. Aymar learned it on a night in his second winter, and this is the night the story has been walking toward since it began. It started the way it always started. The hand on the shoulder, the shape of a brother's arm moving in the low lamplight. Except this time, the hand did not release him gently. It gripped and shook, once, hard, and the man attached to it was already turning away before Aymar's eyes had fully opened. Somewhere above the dormitory, through stone thick enough to swallow most sound, a horn was sounding from the wall. 3 short blasts, a pause, 3 more, and every man in that room who had been asleep a heartbeat earlier was now moving with a speed that had nothing sleepy left in it. There was no silence rule anymore. That vow existed for ordinary nights. This was not an ordinary night. Voices called low but urgent through the dark. Brothers pulling mail over shirts they had never fully taken off. Buckling belts that had never come loose. Reaching for boots kept always in the same place beside the same cot, precisely so that a hand in darkness could find them without searching. Aymar's own hands were shaking, not from cold this time, but he found his mail anyway, found the weight of it settling over shoulders that had carried it 100 times in daylight and never once in the dark like this. And he understood, in the space of maybe 90 seconds, exactly what all those months of silent nights and burning lamps and unremoved belts had been preparing him for. Outside, along the walls of forts like this one, watchmen had already been standing through the cold for hours before the horn ever sounded, because sleep was never given to the whole garrison at once. Some men were always awake somewhere in the dark, shivering at their posts, eyes moving over a landscape that by night became almost impossible to read. Shadows that might be olive trees or might be men. Sounds that might be wind or might be horses, moving low and quiet across ground that by day looked empty and by night looked like it could be hiding an army. It was one of these men, most nights, who first heard what the rest of the fortress could not yet hear. And it was his decision, made alone, in the dark, in the space of a few frightened heartbeats, whether to sound the horn or wait one more moment to be certain. That night, in this telling, the watchman was certain. A raiding party had come up from the south, along a route the garrison had not expected, moving fast enough to close half the distance before the alarm even reached the walls. Records from these years describe attacks like this again and again, sudden, brief, designed less to take a fortress outright than to test it, to probe for a weakness, to catch a garrison half-dressed and half-armed and cut down whatever could be caught before withdrawing into the dark again. A fortress that answered too slowly paid for it in dead brothers found at dawn. A fortress that answered fast enough sometimes drove the raiders off before a single arrow found its mark inside the walls. This was the fortress that answered fast enough. Aymar reached the wall behind men who had done this more times than he had, found his place at a gap between two merlins where he had stood 100 times in daylight drills and never once believed, until this exact moment, that the drilling had been for something real. Below, in the dark, shapes moved. Horses, men, the specific quality of noise that a body learns to recognize as danger, long before the mind finishes deciding what it is looking at. Arrows went out from the wall. Some found targets, some did not. The raiders, finding a garrison awake, armed, and answering within minutes, rather than the half hour they might have hoped for, pulled back into the dark as quickly as they had come. And within perhaps 20 minutes of the first horn blast, the night had gone quiet again. Nobody cheered. There is a version of this story where men cheer, where trumpets play, and a victory is declared. And that version belongs to the tales told long after, not to the men standing cold and shaking on a wall at the middle of the night, breathing hard, waiting to see if the quiet was real, or only a pause before the raiders tried again from another direction. They stood a long while before anyone was told to stand down. When they finally were, Aymar walked back to the dormitory on legs that did not feel entirely like his own, and found his cot exactly where he had left it, the lamp still burning against the far wall exactly as it always did, and the room settling itself back towards sleep, as though nothing at all had happened. Because in the accounting of that order's existence, perhaps nothing unusual had. This was not the only kind of night that broke the ordinary pattern, and not even the worst. Some winters brought sickness through crowded dormitories faster than any raiding party could have managed alone. A cough passed cot to cot, in a room where 40 men breathed the same still air for 8 hours a night, where a fever caught in acres' damp winter air could spread through half a garrison before anyone understood what they were dealing with. There was no rule of silence strong enough to stop a man's lungs from betraying him in the dark, and the same discipline that kept the house quiet also, in its way, hid the earliest signs of illness longer than perhaps it should have. A cough swallowed rather than spoken about, because speaking about it after Compline broke a vow, and some men, it is recorded in scattered accounts from these decades, held their silence past the point where speaking might have brought them help sooner. Winter itself did not arrive the same way in every stronghold the order held along this coast and its hinterland, and the differences mattered more than most people imagine when they picture the Holy Land as one single unbroken stretch of desert heat. Atlit sat directly on the sea, its walls built out onto a small peninsula, and the wind there in winter came damp and relentless, carrying salt that worked its way into wool and iron alike. Rusting blades left even briefly unattended, chilling men to the bone in a way that felt different from dry cold. Heavier, wetter, harder to shake once it settled into the joints. Safed inland and high above the Sea of Galilee, held a different cold entirely, thinner and sharper, the kind that turned breath visible in torchlight and left frost on stone parapets by the deepest hours of the night. A cold that mountain garrisons everywhere have always known, and coastal men arriving fresh from Europe were rarely prepared for. Gaza, at the desert's edge, gave almost no warning of what its nights would do. Days there could bake a man's skin raw under a sun with no mercy in it, and then, within an hour of sunset, the same air would turn cold enough that the same men found themselves reaching for the very cloaks they had cursed only hours before. Jaffa, a port town, carried Acre's dampness without Acre's crowding, a smaller garrison feeling the sea's chill more directly because there were fewer walls, fewer bodies, less stone between a sleeping man and the open water beyond. And in the valleys around Nazareth and through the Galilee more broadly, low ground trapped the cold overnight the way it trapped mist, so that men posted to smaller holdings there sometimes woke, those few permitted to wake gradually, in houses not under immediate threat, to fields white with frost that would burn away completely within an hour of sunrise, as though the night had never happened at all. Jerusalem itself, in the earlier decades before the city was lost and regained, and lost again, across these turbulent generations, sat high enough in its hills that its winter nights carried a cold visitors rarely expected from a city so associated with sun-baked stone and desert light. Brothers stationed near the old temple precinct, in buildings the order had converted to its own use, described in later memory a chill that settled into the ancient stone walls and stayed there long after any fire had burned itself out. A chill that felt to men raised on stories of the holy city as a place of eternal warmth and light, like one more piece of evidence that the real Jerusalem and the imagined one were not the same place at all. And Tortosa, further north along the coast, held its own particular kind of night, a coastal keep facing open water on one side and hostile territory pressing close on the other, its garrison living with a specific kind of vigilance that came from knowing help, if it were ever needed, might be days away by sea rather than hours away by road. Men posted there learned quickly that the cold and the danger were not separate problems to be solved one after another, but a single condition to be endured together, night after night, for as long as their posting lasted. Not every one of these fortresses came through its trials the way Aymar's had that night. Up at Safed, decades into the order's long hold on that hilltop above the Sea of Galilee, a garrison every bit as disciplined, every bit as practiced in the same clothed sleep and the same burning lamps and the same silent nights, found itself facing a siege that no amount of readiness could answer, because readiness had never been designed to solve a shortage of food, or a shortage of men, or an enemy patient enough to wait through weeks instead of a single raid turned back before dawn. The details that survive from that siege are not the details of a single bad night. They are the details of many nights added together, each one a little harder than the last, each one taking a little more from men who had nothing left to spend, until the terms offered from outside the walls began to look, to exhausted defenders, like the only remaining door out of a room that had otherwise sealed itself shut. What happened after that garrison walked out under promised safe conduct is recorded in more than one chronicle, and none of them describe safe conduct at all. It is a detail worth carrying forward carefully, without exaggeration, because the surviving accounts differ on exact numbers and exact circumstances the way accounts from any chaotic medieval siege tend to differ. But the broad shape agrees closely enough across sources that historians treat it as established rather than legend. Discipline had kept that garrison alive, night after cold night, for as long as discipline was the thing being tested. It could not, in the end, conjure food that did not exist, or reinforcements that were never coming. And the same rule of clothed, watchful, silent sleep that had saved Amar's fortress in one telling had simply run out of time to matter in another. This is the part of the story that sits uneasily beside the part that came before it. And it should. The lamp burning all night, the belt never fully loosened, the readiness trained into a body until it moved before the mind had caught up. None of this made these men invincible. It bought them margin. Sometimes, that margin was enough to turn a raiding party back into the dark it had come from. Sometimes, it was not enough to outlast a siege that had time on its side in a way no amount of discipline could answer. Both of these truths lived inside the same order, often inside the same decade, sometimes inside garrisons that could see each other's watchfires across the same stretch of country. A brother posted to one fortress might spend a career answering alarms that always ended by morning. A brother posted to another might spend his final weeks watching stores dwindle, while the same disciplined silence held around him, offering no answer at all to the specific problem closing in from outside the walls. Across every one of these places, the same core discipline held the men together in ways that went beyond mere obedience to written rules. Something happens between men who have shivered silently in the same dark room for months, who have felt the same hand on the same shoulder in the same startled instant, who have stood the same freezing watch and heard the same distant sounds that might be nothing or might be everything. It is not the kind of brotherhood built in a single battle or a single victory. It is built slowly, in small shared discomforts repeated so many times, they stop being separate memories and become simply the shape of a life. One man passing a spare blanket to another without a word because words were forbidden, and the gesture said everything the vow of silence would not let his mouth say. A brother sliding closer on a bitter night, not for warmth exactly, though the warmth mattered, but because a body beside another body in that cold and that danger meant something that had no need of language. There were nights that had nothing to do with raids or offices at all. Nights when the thing keeping a man awake beneath his blanket was simply his own mind, turning over distances he could not undo. A brother might lie in the dark, counting months since he had last heard his own language spoken by anyone outside these walls, since he had last eaten food that tasted like the place he came from, since he had last slept anywhere that did not require a belt at his waist and a weapon within reach of his hand. The vow of silence gave these thoughts nowhere to go. A man in a European monastery wrestling with doubt or homesickness in the dark might at least know that morning would bring familiar fields, a familiar language spoken beyond the cloister walls, some thread connecting him back to the life he had left. A man in a garrison on this coast had no such thread. Beyond these walls lay a land whose customs, whose crops, whose calls to prayer from towers not his own, all reminded him daily of exactly how far from home he had traveled to be shivering under a thin blanket in the dark. Some brothers managed this quietly, the way Amar mostly did, letting the discipline of the rule carry them through the hours when their own thoughts might otherwise have pulled them apart. Others did not manage it as well, and the record of that struggle survives mostly in silences of its own, in the absence of certain names from later chapter rolls, In occasional mentions of brothers granted leave to return to houses in the West for reasons the surviving documents do not spell out plainly. Fear, in this life, was not something a man could speak aloud after Compline, no matter how loudly it moved through him, and so fear found other ways out. It showed in hands that gripped a sword hilt too tightly during an ordinary watch. It showed in brothers who volunteered for extra duty rather than lie still with their own thoughts. It showed sometimes in nothing at all, in a man who simply endured night after night, year after year, until the endurance itself became indistinguishable from the rest of his character. The fear folded so deep beneath the discipline that even he could no longer find the seam between them. This is, in the end, what almost nobody imagines when they picture these men. Not the charge, not the siege engines, not the banners snapping in desert wind. This, the ordinary, repeated, unglamorous experience of trying to rest inside a body, kept in a state of readiness so constant, it barely counted as rest at all. A shirt never fully removed, a belt never fully unbuckled, a light that never went out, a silence that held even grief and fever inside it without complaint, because complaint had no place in the only kind of survival these men had been given to work with. There is a final winter worth telling, because it closes something this story opened at the very beginning, and because it is the winter that, more than any other, shows what all those ordinary knights had actually been preparing these men to face. By the last years these men held the coast. Acre stood as the final major stronghold left to them in this land, and Amir, older now, his hair gone gray at the temples in a way the desert sun and the coastal damp had both worked into him over the decades, still slept the way he had learned to sleep as a young man fresh from tours. Shirt, breeches, stockings, belt loosened but looped, lamp burning against the far wall. The habits of a lifetime do not leave a man simply because the world around him has begun to change in ways he can feel more than name. A tension in the garrison that had not been there in earlier years. Reports carried in from the countryside with an edge of urgency that older brothers recognized, even when younger ones did not yet know to be afraid. The last ordinary night in that dormitory looked exactly like every other night that had come before it across all those decades. A hand on a shoulder for the night office, a short walk through cold stone corridors, a handful of murmured psalms, a walk back, a lamp still burning. Nobody in that room lying down again in the dark, silent because silence was still the rule even now, could have said with certainty whether the coming days would bring one more raid turned back at the walls, or something the garrison's long discipline would not be enough to answer. What we know from the record is only this, that the pattern these men had lived by for generations, the shirt and the belt and the lamp and the silence, existed for exactly this kind of night. The kind where nobody could know in advance which category it would fall into until the horn actually sounded or did not. That is the whole of what these habits were ever built for. Not glory, not certainty, just the smallest possible margin of readiness purchased at the cost of every comfortable night these men might otherwise have had, spent instead lying half-armed in the cold, waiting for a hand that might come to wake them for prayer, or might come to wake them for something that would decide, in the space of a few frightened minutes, whether they saw morning at all. Records from these final weeks describe a siege that came not as a single raiding party testing the walls before dawn, but as an army settling in for weeks, engines rolling into place along a front too wide for any garrison, however disciplined, to answer everywhere at once. The Order's Grand Master himself stood among the defenders in those last days and fell defending a gate that could not, in the end, be held by will alone. whatever the chronicles that survive choose to say about the manner of it. What matters here is not the words attributed to him afterward by writers who were not standing where he stood. Most of that came later, shaped by men trying to give meaning to a defeat too large to sit with plainly. What matters is smaller and stranger. That the same discipline which had turned back raiders in 100 forgotten nights, the same lamp and belt and silence that had kept Amar's fortress standing decades earlier, was still being observed, brother by brother. In dormitories a short walk from walls already crumbling under engines that had been pounding them for weeks, men still rose clothed. Men still kept the light burning as long as there was oil left to burn. Habits built to buy a few minutes margin against a raiding party do not know how to answer a siege army with time and engines on its side. And yet, the habits held anyway. Because by then, holding them was the only thing these men still knew how to do. When Acre finally fell, in the spring that closed this chapter of the Order's presence in the Holy Land for good, word reached the coastal fortress at Atlit within days, carried by ships and by refugees moving north and south along a coastline that had, until recently, felt like solid ground beneath the Order's feet. Atlit itself had never fallen to siege in all the years it had stood. Its walls, its sea access, its careful stores had made it the one place along this coast that raiders and armies alike had mostly left alone. But a fortress does not exist for its own sake. It exists to hold a piece of a larger position, and with Acre gone, with Jaffa and Gaza and so much else already lost across the preceding decades, Atlit's garrison faced a decision that no wall, however thick, could make for them. Within months, by choice rather than by defeat, the brothers who remained abandoned the fortress that had never been taken from them, boarding ships bound for Cyprus, leaving behind dormitories where lamps had burned every night for generations, where belts had loosened one notch and no further for the length of entire careers, where silence had held through fevers and frost and fear for longer than most of the men who kept it could have explained if asked why. Somewhere in one of those last dormitories, in Acre or in Atlit in the months just after, a lamp burned low against a stone wall. For what may have been among the final nights it was ever lit for that purpose, and however many men remained to lie beneath it, dressed for whatever the night still had left to give them, nobody spoke, because the silence had never really been about the rule by then. It had become the only language they had left for everything they were too tired, too cold, and too afraid to say out loud. The lamp is long gone now. The stone is still there, in places, worn smooth by feet that crossed it in the dark 1,000 times on the way to prayers nobody living remembers the sound of. What is harder to see standing in those ruins today is the specific quality of that cold, the particular weight of a belt never removed, the exact texture of a silence held for years at a time, the ordinary, unglamorous discipline that let a few hundred men hold ground, an empire wanted back, one freezing, half-sleeping night after another, for far longer than anyone watching from a comfortable distance ever expected them to.